I think most of us know Lawrence has been on from time to time and presented before. Lawrence, as you mentioned, this with the Puerto Rican Alliance, SEIU 721. Lawrence and I go way back doing work in solidarity with the Puerto Rican independence struggle and bringing various former excarcerated political prisoners of the Puerto Rican movement here to Los Angeles. Nicole is part of a new generation of Puerto Rican activists in Southern California with Puerto Ricans in Action, as she said. That's the T-shirt here that I got from them, and they've had some amazing rallies, do a tremendous amount of material aid, solidarity work, and have really reactivated the support for independence and participated in bringing Oscar Lopez Rivera here and many other activities over many, many years now. And she's a veteran herself at a younger age. I'll let them say more about themselves as they get into the presentation. I'm not sure which one of you is going first. Is that Nicole? Okay, go ahead. And Nicole has the PowerPoint, I think, this morning to share with us and can screen share. So you might want to, if you're viewing it as a gallery, you might want to switch to speaker view.
Thanks, Michael, and everyone. Yes, I'm going to share my screen in a second. Just thanks for being so interested in this and to invite me here. Michael and Lawrence, they were kind of day one support, part of our support network. So I'm in good company, and I've been in this movement work, I think, in around Puerto Rico since 2016, the summertime when Promesa was being debated and voted upon in Congress. So since then, it's been nonstop. I'm going to share this screen now. So I'm going to be covering the topic of the state of emergency that was declared in January to address violence against women. This was a rally or a gathering my group held in late May, and the women, these are most of the individuals who have been murdered along the edges. I think just this week we had one more young woman, and she's about 22, that was murdered. So it's very present. I think the next slide here. There we go. So this is a cover of a report that was completed in 2019 by two organizations, nonprofits in Puerto Rico, that Kilómetro Cero, which is it works to be a citizen oversight for police, try to collect statistics, and generally protecting life and rights and safety and issues around justice. And then another group called Proyecto Matria, which is specifically focused on the rights of women, and they believe in economic development for them that helps to just overall their
Nicole, if you can speak up a little because you're slightly fuzzy, I think.
Okay. Do I just need to talk louder, or is it fuzzy?
That's perfect, yes.
Okay, so just talk louder. Great. So this report came out, and during this time, there was a major feminist group called the Colectiva Feminista en Construcción in Puerto Rico, and they had already, they had taken up the mantle of sort of decades of work by activists, anti-violence groups. There's a kind of a broad coalition of gender equality groups that have been pushing for kind of bring this issue to the forefront for several decades, and just noting the continuous uptick in femicides. And so this report really laid that bare. And so some of those statistics, going back to 2012, Puerto Rico had the highest per capita rate of femicides in the world. And then starting in 2014, this report showed that there was basically a murder every week throughout these, throughout the years. And so there was something like a total of 266 femicides. And in 2019, the governor after Rosselló, created a pink alert. And it was both criticized for not being obviously strong enough, and it wasn't actually ever enacted until this year, when a young woman named Keisha was disappeared and eventually found not murdered. So 2020 actually brought the highest number of killings of women. There was a total of 60 for the year. And within that, there were 6 trans women. And in general, in Puerto Rico, there's, I think so I have the statistic that trans women are 258 times more likely to be murdered there than anywhere in the United States. So groups in Puerto Rico, I have here, the next slide, this was the state of emergency that was declared, just to show this. And this order created a coalition called, or a committee, a working group called the Committee for Prevention, Support, Rescue, and Education of Gender Violence, PARE, Comité PARE. And it's made up of 12 subcommittees to address public policy, legislation, security, housing, education. And they just, I think the last week or this month, made some announcements. There was huge criticism early May about we were hitting sort of the 100-day marks, and there was nothing was happening. There was no transparency. Groups really took to the streets. And so they recently just announced that that they're rolling out a curriculum that'll be integrated into every subject matter across K through 12 in Puerto Rico, and to integrate a gender perspective, and that was part of this order. And this committee, the intention is to oversee each of these initiatives. There's also new protocols and standardizing of data collected in the public sector on violence against women. So I think they're just about ready to release those, and that would essentially, I think, talk about interagency management, more electronic supervisions of agencies, and who sort of chain of responsibility in each agency, so housing, health, and another key component of this executive order, the idea was to launch a mobile app to help victims ask for help. There is a new program to check in with women filing for restraining orders, supposed to be a media campaign, and boosting of professional opportunities to improve financial independence. So a point of reference there, for instance, I think this year alone, there was close to 7,000 protection orders requested, and about 68% of them were denied. And the governor at the time when, let's see, yeah, I'll leave it here on this page. So they, other issues around reporting and data, unfortunately, there's a huge backlog of rape kits. There is consistently miscategorizing of offenses. And so a lot of the community groups who have been organizing around this definitely see they start from a very intersectional position, and they center the role of trans women, of Black women, of immigrant women, and they realize that that this sort of miscategorizing, this connection to culture, just a patriarchal, machismo kind of culture that sees a lot of domestic violence as just an interpersonal issue, that's a problem of values, and so this just invisibilizing the issue, yes. These groups try to bring to the forefront the issue of misgendering trans victims in the media, at the police level, and pointing out that between 2015 and 2019, in the previous report I showed documented that there was 449 complaints against officers for domestic violence. And so they have impunity. There's supposed to be, a domestic violence division that has internal protocols to deal with this. And so there's obviously just this issue of transparency that the groups are calling for. So I'm gonna move here. Okay. So this was in May happening. This was May 7th. Prior to a few days before this, there was a call to meet in front of the governor's mansion. And so around 600 or more people, women did that. And they're really calling. And then a few days later, they had an island-wide events. I think there was 24 cities, and including Vieques, the small island, to come out. And so I have some of those photos, but here, this is, I've collected some of them from different municipalities. And they're these, the groups, so this one, I'll go through these. So here they're in some towns they were able to meet with the mayor. I think this is the mayor, and others they met with police chiefs. Others they were ignored.
Alcaldías is like city hall or mayor's office. Is that
right? City hall, yeah, the mayor's office, right? And this looks like Old San Juan. Yeah. And so the groups are, the colectiva, like Nicole is asking, they have three major pillars, and they've really been calling for these things, and since 2014 when they were founded. They want an educational campaign to inform victims on how to recognize the signs of gender violence, an integrated approach to resources for survivors, including flexible employment laws, public housing, accessible healthcare, and then an educational curriculum through a gender perspective in all schools. So these are two, I brought this in, it's very painful stories, but these two, the death of these two women, the murder really sparked a huge outcry in April and March, in early May. And so this all kind of coalesced around the two of them. And Keisha at the bottom, it was her case which the pink alert was activated to. The governor made a big, had a lot of, and made some announcements during this time, one of which I thought was, that I mentioned was he had put in the budget funding for education on this topic, and the Fiscal Oversight Board, right, has ultimate, so say in Puerto Rico's budget, and they had, he had asked, I think he had put in like a line item for 600,000 to be devoted to this, and they had approved 200,000. So that kind of came out around when these murders were making news, and so eventually the chair of the board, made a big deal that they would approve not just the 600,000, but I think it was like 7 million for this cause. So the feminist groups, the women's groups are, really trying to push individual towns and mayors to start asking for that funding, to start integrating in local initiatives. And there was another interesting issue around Keisha's murder. There was the Felix is a boxer, well known in Puerto Rico, and so he was arrested in by federal agents. So there was this issue of, for a minute, and I think it's been resolved, but how would the death penalty be on the table for him? Because in Puerto Rico, that's had been outlawed, but not at a federal level. And so there was, the family wasn't asking for that. People weren't asking for that, but it got a little entangled. So these are some, the groups after the kind of island-wide protest, they had a report back and they made some of that public. So these are some of the feedback. And this is saying how there's kind of signs and billboards everywhere, from churches to furniture stores to markets, expressing themselves about gender violence, but there's nothing visible coming out from the state. So where is the state of emergency? If they're responsible and ignoring this? And here, oops. This was another important point, which was to decentralize San Juan, where there are somewhat resources for individuals, and looking at smaller towns. And so in this case, the town Nahuabo, they have the 3rd highest rate of femicides, and there is no resources. There's not one program devoted to this, and there's not one person that really has training in this at the city level on how to deal with gender violence. And this one, okay. Oh yeah, and this was talking about why don't mayors start asking for this funding that's been approved. So I want to also point out that the executive order, all of this at the state levels had huge support and really being consistently supported and pushed through by the Independence Party. There's a newer party, the Movimiento Victoria Ciudadano, that their members, senators have just been tirelessly pushing for these designations. And I'm going to just leave this here with this image. And this image, going back to just the intersectional approach of women's groups, they're at every avenue, every issue, they're present. And this was a recent protest against the privatization of the energy company to hand it over to Luma. And then I know this might be a good transition into Lawrence's presentation. And I do want to end maybe when Lawrence is done, or I don't know if this is a good place, but I do have a short video where we can hear just the current list of names of women this year that have been murdered. And so I don't know if this would be an okay time to do it, or if I should just wait until after Lawrence's presentation. What do you think, Lawrence?
Up to you, I think.
Up to me?
I think
okay.
We should probably wait till after.
After, right?
It'll be a good accumulation of your presentation, I think.
Thank you. Okay, so I think Lawrence, I'll go ahead and stop sharing now.
Okay. No, you could leave that. Actually, if you could leave the bomberas up, that'll be fine.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Thank you, Nicole, for really shedding light.
Let me mute myself so you can appear as a speaker. Will that happen?
Okay. Do you hear me? Mic check?
You're fine.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank my comrade, Sister Michelle. I don't know why I said that. Sister Nicole, for sharing and highlighting. The fact is that in the Puerto Rican tradition and the Puerto Rican culture, in the Boricua culture, women are very strong. And as we know, that even throughout the movements, I know Fred Hampton always said you could You could kill the revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution. But the whole idea of femicide is the idea of trying to go to the seed and killing and decimating the seed and getting rid of the seed. And the women in our culture are very strong and are very, very much our leaders and very much the carriers of wisdom. And so I just wanted to highlight that because I could just think of my family with the amount of sisters and my mother and how wise and very vital she was, not only to our family, but to the entire community, as she was a union nurse and a union organizer. And she taught me a lot. So I want to shift a little bit, and I just want to highlight another thing. Fernando is a Filipino comrade, and we have a common history. We were invaded in the 1800s by the United States, and we were colonized by the United States after the transition of Spanish annexation, if you will. So I just wanted to recognize that, along with Hawaii and Guam and Cuba and the Philippines, Filipino brothers and sisters that also have continued to suffer at the hands of U.S. foreign policy. And as we know, in Puerto Rico, we are in the middle of a labor struggle in regards to LUMA, which is a private energy conglomerate, if you will, a venture conglomerate that is trying to take over the electrical grid of Puerto Rico, which is PREPA. PREPA is the Puerto Rican Electrical Power Authority. I remember growing up as a kid that PREPA was a very a big employer of unionized jobs in Puerto Rico, and that is going by the wayside. So we are there are over 25 unions and other community organizations that are in the struggle to make sure that LUMA does not gain the contract to essentially engulf PREPA, which is the Puerto Rican Electrical Power Authority. And as you know, Puerto Rico is a colony, and it's a colony of the United States after it was passed over, as it was passed on from Spain after the Spanish-American War, if you could call that a war. There was very little resistance. And before you know it, the United States bought these major venture vultures like Wells Fargo and other banking industries to monetize and devalue, in fact, get rid of the Puerto Rican currency that did exist at one time, and flooded the Puerto Rican economy with low wage monetary policy, exploitation of sugarcane workers and farmers who we call jibaros. And jibaro is someone that is very endeared in the Puerto Rican tradition, because they are the carriers of the way we have our relationship with the land, our music, and our people. Puerto Ricans is a mixture of three. We are indigenous, Aragua Taino descendants. We also have Western African blood that we proudly embrace. Not that there's no absence of racism in Puerto Rico, just like there's racism in Cuba. There's a contradictions that in Cuba are openly discussed. And then we have the, what I would call, and this is just my opinion, the bastard European blood, which is the imposition of Spanish blood through many forms of oppression and femicide that I believe began at the very inception of the Spanish Empire invading and assigning people slavery status or indentured, if you will. If you were lucky, you were an indentured servant, and you would get to travel to go to Spain and be showcased to the queen and the kings of many European countries. So where do we stand today? Where we stand today, SEIU 721 and the many caucuses of SEIU have endorsed the call to struggle to cancel, not engage in the contract with the venture vulture conglomerate Luma, which is an energy conglomerate that is trying to take over the energy grid in Puerto Rico. Now, the struggles in Puerto Rico have been successful, like the exit of the U.S. military industrial complex off the islands of Vieques and Isla Mona, that was also bombed and used as target practice, has been victories as a result of both all sectors closing ranks and coming together to engage in the struggle, to get rid of the Navy out of Vieques, get rid of the Marines out of Isla Mona, because Puerto Rico is also composed of another additional 5 little islands outside of the main island of Puerto Rico. And so those struggles were victories as a result of essentially the principles of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, which was peaceful civil disobedience and intensive civil disobedience to prevent the continuing bombing and the decimation of our natural resources. As you know, in addition to Luma, you have venture hedge funders from Wall Street that are trying to buy up the natural resources in Puerto Rico, such as the beaches and other resources such as the rainforest and other natural resources. Puerto Rico is called the Enchanted Island for good reason, because it is an enchanted paradise. It is an enchanted space, and it's just a wonder of nature, if you will. So that's part of our struggle as well. And the other part of our struggle is also being able to hold on to our teachings and our language, our culture, our drumming, as the drumming that we inherited from our Equatorian Western African brothers and sisters that brought the drum to the island, the bata and the bomba drum and the quinto, that enriches, just made us better people. Jasmine is driving. Hi, Jasmine. She took over the picture. Okay, so I'm a summarize. But I just want to say that whatever you can do to engage in support of preventing these venture capitalists and these vultures from essentially the process that's going on right now is decimation, depopulation, and eradication, right? The population of Puerto Rico now is 60%, maybe a little bit over 60% of the inhabitants on the island of Puerto Rico are Puerto Rican. There's been a lot of foreign investment or gentrification, outright decimation of our natural resources, as it's happening right now on the island of Puerto Rico. So whatever, I'd like to encourage you to support the organization that Nicole represents, Puerto Ricans in Action. They do a lot of that. They've done hurricane relief work. They've done water development, being able to share those resources. They've done a lot of grassroots groundwork. I belong to the I founded an organization called the Puerto Rican Alliance of Los Angeles that is Puerto Ricans 101 and Nicole is Puerto Ricans 202. So they are definitely more, and we support their work. And also, I also encourage you to, and maybe Nicole could share some of the mutual aid societies that are currently exist in Puerto Rico. The one that I could remember the most, and the one that I visited when I was in Puerto Rico 2 years ago before the pandemic, is Casa del Pueblo, which is an excellent grassroots community-based organization that I would encourage you to consider donating to. And I think Nicole would, if not, we could share that with Anthony or with IJUJC, those resources that you could tap into and donate or just support any way that you can. Whether it's writing a letter to your local elected official, to your federal senator. There's also a lot of things happening right now in terms of the status question. And there is a bill that was introduced by Alessandro Ocasio-Cortez and Lidia Velasquez, which is called I'll let Nicole, I think it's called the Puerto Rican Self-Determination Act or something like that.
Right.
So I'll let Nicole share that. But I'm gonna close here. I've been doing this for a long time. I want to make an announcement on July 25th. We will be having an event commemorating and highlighting the invasion of the United States onto Puerto Rico and all the other so-called what they call territories. And we know them as colonies. Although the Philippines have obtained some measure of self-determination, U.S. foreign policy is still very criminal against the Filipino people. And we know the decimation of Hawaii as a result of the depopulation. And that's the same design that the United States has on us, is being able to depopulate, disseminate, and decimate the Puerto Rican population, and as a result of it, making it into what we know as an enchanted paradise. It will become a resort for the rich and famous. So with that, I'll close there. Thank you very much, Anthony, for inviting us. I have a lot of respect for the work that I could never get the acronym right, but the Interfaith Communities for Justice and Peace. Did I get it right, Michael? No, I still haven't got it right? But anyway, IJUJC, me and Michael always corrects me. But I've been in the struggle with you, and I appreciate you being in the struggle with me. And as always, I support the great work that you do, and I will continue to do so. And as I want to commemorate the passing and the transition of Chief Leonard Crow Dog, who was a spiritual leader of the American Indian movement. And I want to close by saying I want to memorize Didan Kamati, former producer and programmer at KPFK, Freedom Now, when he would always say, "Ready for the revolution, I stand ready for the revolution." Thank you.
Nicole, did you want to show that video?
Yes. Okay. Oh, I have to. Stop share to include the audio. Okay. It's mostly audio and not.
Santos.
There it is. Yeah, you got it.
Inés Rodríguez Ramos. Presente. Lucita Alicea Delgado. Presente. Luz Pérez Santiago.
Any thoughts, comments, or questions from anybody? I don't know about that.
Thank you, Nicole. I was also, okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
Yes, first of all, Michael, I don't see the raise hand function in the participant list. I don't know if that's something that has to be activated.
I don't know. On mine, it's the reactions button at the bottom. If you click on reactions, you'll see.
There it is.
Yeah, there you go.
So folks, if you go to reactions at the bottom of the Zoom screen and click on reactions, underneath the icons, there's raise hand. So that's a helpful way if Fernando is calling on people. I just want to thank Nicole and Lawrence very much. I learned a lot from this. You know, we are an activist group, and maybe starting with Lawrence, what is the political resistance to statehood for Puerto Rico and sovereignty? And are the California elected officials supportive? Are there elected officials we should target to either thank them for support or to urge them to support statehood?
So I will go to, I will answer just briefly on the current resistance. The resistance is shifted. The resistance is led by the new generation, different forms of organizing, which is, I think, a great thing, because the resistance I was part of is the object conditions remain the same, Steve, but the resistance is more powerful. And in regards to which elected officials and stuff to write to and how to engage in being a support, I would leave that to Nicole to articulate. Nicole?
Yes. So there's efforts, I think, to specifically reach out to the members of the Natural Resource Committee, at least on the congressional side. I haven't heard any engagement by like state senators or the state side making comments like there has been. I think in Illinois at the state legislature, they had a declaration of support for the Self-Determination Act. But here, so like Grace Napolitano, up and down the state, Jim Costa, Huffman, Lowenthal, and Lowenthal was one of the last meetings I participated. We did have a conversation with his staffer who staffs him on that committee, and he was very positive to our feedback on the opposition to the statehood bill, but he hasn't come out. There are several representatives who have taken support on both pieces of legislation. So Lowenthal, and then Katie Porter, she's supported the self-determination, and Brownlee, and probably, and I know unfortunately this Padilla has come out in support of the statehood legislation. We've had a meeting with his office just to give feedback and ask, that they consider supporting both pieces. Feinstein office hasn't taken a position on either. And then Nanette Barajan, she has supported, and then I forget his name, who oversees downtown LA right now, but they both, along with Padilla in California, and I think Lowenthal have all supported the statehood officially right now. Yeah.
Could you name and give us the numbers of the two bills?
Yes, definitely. So let me do this.
While you do that, Nicole, if I could just add something real quick. So Spain tried to do the same thing that the United States is doing back in the 1800s. And it was stated that Spain cannot give something it doesn't have. And some of us on the pro-independence side, we just don't believe that, again, after all the atrocities and after all the acts and the impositions on the Puerto Rican people, that the U.S. Congress is the avenue. But the discussion definitely needs to be had, and that's where me and Nicole have some agreement on.
Right. And so I'm showing, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify to people who maybe don't understand exactly what's at issue is that historically in the U.S. politics, the Republican Party in the United States tended to align with the Statehood Party in Puerto Rico, and the Democratic Party tended to align with the Commonwealth Party in Puerto Rico, and the independence movement in Puerto Rico was aligned with neither of them. More recently, and since Obama, the U.S. has also, the Democratic Party in the U.S. has started to promote the idea of statehood as a resolution for the colonial contradiction of Puerto Rico. And I think that's very problematic because, as Lawrence said, the history of what happened with Hawaii, of annexation, and it's an attempt to create a Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans. The Democrats are pushing for statehood along the idea. It's different from DC statehood. DC statehood is the lack of representation of people in the United States who are part of the United States and not having a full representation as that. But Puerto Rico is not part of the United States. The Supreme Court ruled that it belongs to, but it's not part of the United States. And so the idea is that the Democrats think they could get 2 more Senate seats if they could get Puerto Rico and get it to align with the Democratic Party. And that's a very opportunistic and unresponsive to the actual needs of the Puerto Rican people. So the self-determination is to say Puerto Rico has the right to determine its own destiny, not based on U.S. political realities or concerns. And in particular, true self-determination would involve the U.S. actually withdrawing its military forces, because it's impossible to have an actual act of self-determination by an election in which, you know, the country is still occupied militarily by another power.
Right, and the Intercept did they've, I think last month released a report on some of the money behind pushing the statehood legislation, and it's a lot of people, a lot of funders that were pushing, or people funding for Promesa when that was being up for the vote. So on the states, in Puerto Rico, the proponents of that piece of legislation are pretty much the people who are against all forms of life in the legislature there. So disappointing.
Just to clarify, does your group support both of these, the self-determination and the statehood bill, or one or the other?
We support the self-determination. I'm part of there's actually a coalition of a small working group of me, our group, and then in the Bay Area, another collective called the Bay Area Alliance for Sustainable Puerto Rico, and some other just people who are come together to do some of these calls. So we are supporting the Self-Determination Act.
I just want to be clear that I don't support either one of them, but I do support the idea that a conversation on a popular assembly needs to take place. And
which is the Self-Determination Act. That's the popular assembly.
Right. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying, is to have a popular assembly where the people could voice their concerns. But I, as a young lord and as our devout nationalist, I don't believe that.
Right, you don't support it.
I don't support it. So,
but there are a lot of groups on the island. They're starting to do listening sessions on the island regarding this congressionally, right? And there are a lot of groups. Yeah.
The thing I do support is la conversatoria, right? The conversation that needs to take place.
Yes, so I can share this link on our website. We have our some preset emails and letters. So any other questions or comments?
I tried to put your address in the chat and I realized I left out a W, so it might not work, but people can see it. I did have an additional question for Nicole or two, going back to the question of femicides. And I'm wondering two things. One, one of the slides you showed, it said that there are billboards from, I think it said supermarkets and churches opposing femicide, but where is the government, where the state was? I wonder if you could say a little more about if there is any role of different faith-based organizations. The other question also related to what came up about Hawaii and the Philippines is that there and other societies as well, the role of, if there is any documented role of U.S. military personnel in Puerto Rico that have, been involved with, acts of violence against Puerto Rican women. I know that's happened in many other cases where, U.S. Navy or Marines and so on are stationed in Okinawa and other places where there's been a major issue. And I'm wondering if it's happening in Puerto Rico as well. Thank you.
Yeah, in the coalitions in Puerto Rico, I'm assuming that they're faith-based organizations there. None come to mind off the top of my head. None have made it. I think some of them might be involved in supporting shelters. There are a dwindling number of domestic violence shelters, and that's a big concern of lack of resources. And what the last point you made about the impact, military impact on this. I had those thoughts after the hurricane when there was like an influx of military personnel and National Guard into Puerto Rico, like wondering that, but I don't hear anybody attempting to address that or talk about it. There is.
Thank you. I see a bunch of hands up. Fernando.
I don't see him. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Fernando, Carol Francis, and Anthony. I'm not sure who's first.
Who's first?
Hi.
I'm not sure. Go ahead, Fernando.
Well, I didn't mean to raise my hand, but what's happening there is really similar to what's happening in the Philippines as well, even though they give us a so-called fake independent. And this is really very disturbing, that's happening amongst women and so forth. We have this old saying that every time the U.S. got a cold, we have pneumonia. And I guess this is the mark of this neoliberalization policies, this privatization and so forth, and the hand of this giant capitalist is really affecting all of us. And so I just wanted to say that, but I didn't mean to raise my hand. I'm trying to, I don't know, I pressed something, but anyhow.
Anthony?
All right, first I want to thank you for your presentation. It was really helpful. I don't really know that much about Puerto Rico, so what you've shared has really enlightened me. I have been to Hawaii, and I know that in 1957, I think Hawaiians were offered, the residents of Hawaii, not the Hawaiian people, but the residents of the state of Hawaii were offered the option of remaining a territory or a statehood. Those are the only two options. They weren't offered the option of independence, and they chose statehood. And I think there was a referendum in Puerto Rico a couple of years ago in which three options were offered, and it was statehood, independence, and the status quo. And I think overwhelmingly, those who took part in the referendum chose statehood. So help me understand where you think about that referendum and where you think Puerto Ricans are at if they had a choice about which option to choose. Which option do you think that most of the residents of Puerto Rico would choose if they could choose?
So let me jump on that real quick.
Yeah, please help me to understand this because I really don't understand.
So the plebiscite, as they called, that happened in Puerto Rico 3 years ago, was something that most there was an electoral boycott over I think 60% of the electorate, and usually in Puerto Rico people vote, people go out and vote. but they did not vote for that referendum. Then the most recent iteration of a plebiscite was a yes or no question. And the yes for statehood barely won, in spite of all the money that they spent and all the venture capitalists and all the hedge funders that invested, and the fear mongering that went on, that the social safety net will fall through the hole and all of that. So so that was the most recent referendum. So there's never one of the things that Puerto Rican people do affirm doing these plebiscites and these referendums is that they want to remain Puerto Rican. So that's the best way I can answer that. And I think that's the safest way I can answer that, that they definitely do not want, they confirmed that they do not want statehood and that they want to remain, maintain their Puerto Rican identity. And as you know, the indigenous people of Hawaii really did not participate in that choice, that those two choices that they gave them when back in 1957, from what I understand. And I'll yield to Nicole.
Yeah, I'll add, I think the governor, the federal commissioner of Puerto Rico, the commissioner, Jennifer Gonzalez. So I think they're okay with this idea that there's going to be, if statehood were to happen, that 20% of the population is Puerto Rican. They're okay with that, which this whole concept of a Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans is just what's it's been at, I think, in the narrative since 1898. There has been, like Lauren said, the last referendum and plebiscite, and really those two words don't explain what these things are. There's more of just like a consultation, because there's no authority behind it. There's nothing legal to it. The Congress isn't involved. The Justice Department doesn't even approve the votes, such as the last referendum. They didn't approve the results because what was on the ballot was just one option, and it was yes or no question. So they've always said that all three options, and there needs to be explanation, and people need to understand what they're voting on. And so that those factors have not to diminish anybody's capacity to their agency here, but what's sort of a negotiation with Congress is never been deliberated. It's never been an explanation of what would happen going down any single path, and that's I think that's a really big concern. And so, like Lauren said, there was a big boycott. Sequentially, there's been increasingly higher number of people boycotting the elections. And so part of the last tally results was, the statehood vote in the last, this just happened in 2020, only represents, I think the vote represented 25% of the population came out to cast a ballot, and then half of that voted for statehood. So the numbers are incredibly skewed. The Justice Department actually acknowledged that the numbers are inaccurate. And the people pushing for, just the legislation that around statehood are also the most homophobic, racist, sexist legislatures on the island. And it's an interesting, to me, issue because there's a huge cryptocurrency sort of takeover in Puerto Rico. A lot of these billionaires and people, tax incentives have been used across the Caribbean to incentivize people. But in Puerto Rico, these individuals, I actually think, would lean towards independence over statehood. So one of these individuals are actually, they look like to be running for governor soon. So that, I don't know, that's a weird issue. Michael, can you add anything?
Yeah, I did want to add a couple of things. I know Cal Francis has her hand up and we should get to her, but I wanted to say two things. One is people need to understand the impact of colonization and occupation, because the U.S. still, although they've stopped bombing Vieques, the U.S. still has its own military forces. It's the U.S. dollar, it's all the U.S. repressive agencies, including the FBI and others, operate in Puerto Rico. And there has been over decades a tremendous repression directed against the independence movement. Lawrence talked about the Nationalist Party, and there were many political prisoners, and including the leader. Right up until very recently, there have been assassinations of independence leaders in Puerto Rico. And so, people need to understand that very similar to COINTELPRO, here within the United States, there was a tremendous repression against every individual member of the Nationalist Party. They had enormous files kept on people attempting to destroy their livelihood if they advocated for independence. So you can't carry out a fair election under those circumstances of repression and military occupation. So I'll leave it at that.
And if just one other thing, if you get into like who you're talking to, it matters in Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of these women and feminist groups, they're not integrated into this political status issue because they're more concerned on climate change and day-to-day, so it depends what groups you're also talking to.
And if I could just add, before I go to Carol Francis, just want to add, I was listening to a podcast from Maria Hinojosa from Latino USA, and the cryptocurrency economy is really hitting Puerto Rico hard with a lot of hipsters, a lot of biotech and high technology industry coming in and using cryptocurrency. It's another way of devaluing the Puerto Rican economy as the United States did when they got rid of the Puerto Rican currency. So I just wanted to add that.
Carol?
Go ahead, Michael.
Carol?
Carol Francis.
Carol Francis?
Yes, thank you. Building on what you've been saying, would you give us a specific reason why you want independence over statehood? And also, like what you would lose and what you would gain that you wouldn't get from statehood that you could gain from independence. And also, what is the main argument of the statehood people against independence? What are they saying would be a disaster if you became independent? And what your response to that accusation or that?
So I'll go to Nicole, but I want to definitely add to that too. Go ahead, Nicole.
That's a big question. Would it be possible also to hear Rose's question? I have to check out around 9 myself. I just wanted to see if it was Rose, if your question was connected at all to this one. No? Oh, okay. So the Self-Determination Act in terms of the legislation isn't about pushing independence. It actually leaves the door open to there's also people in Puerto Rico who want to remain a colony, maybe a different, like a variation of it. So in my position, I think these at least the status issues has to do with economics, and I have a belief in the self-determination and independence, but it's hard. Your question is a little bit too broad for me to say to respond to. Otherwise, yeah.
I'll take a shot at it. So first of all, I'd like to Cuba for any for Puerto Rican self-determination is supportive of Cuba. So I'd like to think that. I think, I'm under no illusions as a outright nationalist, tempering into being a communist myself. I know that the accumulation of a colony, one of the paradigms is statehood. I'm not adverse to that, but the other thing is self-determination, right? And also one of the other pieces of self-determination is statehood, right? So I'm not unclear about that. But the other thing about self-determination is complete decolonization, right? And also part of decolonization is statehood, okay? So our argument throughout the many years of being oppressed and murdered and being completely decimated as a people, and our leaders having been in prison for their beliefs, have always mentioned that one of the things that we're holding on to is our culture, right? Our culture, our way of being able to determine what kind of economy we want. And that's not going to happen as long as the US Congress is in charge of the conversation or is driving the conversation. So that's something that I understand the conversatorias are a very great idea. The popular assemblies is a very important piece in the Self-Determination Act bill. But my concern is the evidence throughout the years of the imposition of the US Congress. I mean, Fernando said that if the US Congress gets a cold, the Filipino people get the flu. What I'm gonna say, and I'm not gonna say it because it's kind of what my mom used to say, but I'm gonna say that Puerto Ricans can go to the bathroom without the permission of the US Congress. In other words, I can't say it, but I just tell you that in order for us to be able to go into the bathroom and take care of business, and we want to use toilet paper, we have to ask US Congress use of toilet paper. So it's very difficult, Carol. But we also understand that part of the decolonization process and all of these points, a conversation we have, I just don't think that as long as Congress drives it, the Puerto Rican people are likely to be shortchanged again.
Rose had her question, and then
Yes.
Joe also raised his hand, so he's trying to give.
Yes, I'm glad to get this in before Nicole leaves, because I wanted to come back to the femicide. I know that femicide at present is a major problem all across the Caribbean. And I've also heard there's an issue in Brazil, but I'll leave that out now. I'll just talk about the Caribbean cultures. And I know that traditionally they have been very male dominant cultures. But I just wondered, is it worse than it used to be? Is there this kind of thing that's happened to some extent here now, where a certain percentage of men are kind of threatened by the cultural changes happening and they're acting out? Or has the femicide always been about the same level in Puerto Rico?
The uptick was exasperated after the hurricane, like immensely. So that I think was the kind of figures we saw peaking in last year. And we'll see how this year goes. But with the fiscal oversight board, La Junta, also continuing to cut every social services, the public infrastructure, the disinvestment, like all of these factors, the feminist groups are articulating that these are reproducing violence, and they're seeing this the abandonment by the state, and they're complicitly in allowing this to be reproduced. And so, yes, and not the cultural that you're referencing. I haven't read a lot of analysis of if the culture is getting more machismo or not, but in terms of at the state, that I think the policy choices that are being made are increasing the economic insecurities of vulnerability of women across the board. And then within that, funneling down to who are the most vulnerable in that get overlooked. So those, I think, has to do, tied to economic choices, policy choices that the increase is a large result of. And
Thank you.
There's the high level, I'm sure the last statistic of the poverty rate in Puerto Rico is, but I think within, it's something I think within that percentage is like 80% are women-headed households. So that dynamic.
Thank you.
The various of U.S. imperialism is very where you have high rates of public health elements. You have a high rate of what you're seeing in Puerto Rico is post-Cuba, where all situations that happened in Cuba before the revolution is happening in Puerto Rico now. Increase HIV, drug use, prostitution, femicide. This whole idea of self-determination is not.
Joseph?
Hello?
Hi.
Yeah. Lawrence says,
John.
Yeah, I'm back. Can you
go
hear
ahead.
me?
Oh, you're breaking
Yeah,
up.
so
Lawrence.
anyway, I'm not, you hear me?
You have bandwidth problems, Lawrence, maybe.
Yeah. Let me turn off the video.
Joe, why don't you get your question in, Gus, before Nicole leaves?
Okay, sure. Thanks. Some of the recent comments get me thinking about this question of statehood, independence, status quo. It really, it probably is being discussed, but I'd like to hear more about the chances for getting it discussed in very specific terms. Which course of action holds the best promise for people being able to work against economic exploitation in Puerto Rico, cultural eradication, or to work for cultural protection, protection of individual rights and life, including the femicide issue. Is it being analyzed and discussed in terms of where have we got a better shot at having freedom from exploitation? Independence doesn't necessarily do it. Statehood, surely not. Of course, it seems to rest on which situation will permit most freedom to political and economic self-organization among the people. But so I'm less interested in the titles than in the actual practical meaning for liberation organizing in the different situations. Any comments on that would be welcome.
Go ahead, Nicole. Since you got the go, I'll go after you.
I think that what comes to mind is I know the Independence Party has created an outline of how independence could move forward and be successful. So I'd say that in terms of like hyper local organizing, I don't think much time is given to those questions. I think issues around climate and then like being self-sustainable regardless outside of that, sort of there's a academic who talks about, kind of a post-sovereign state and just moving beyond issues of sovereignty entirely for a lot of community groups. And so becoming going solar, going like renewable as much as they can at local levels, creating collective community grids, mutual, going more towards mutual aid. That's more of the focus. And some of the women I've talked to in these spaces are asking more like, why not put this effort behind advocating for political status issues? Why not put that energy behind a climate crisis and those efforts? Because that's what's going to mean life or death for us.
So Anthony, Joseph, a great question. Coffee has to be grown, right? And I think and that's where we need to go. We need to go back to the land in order to liberate ourselves from the colonial mentality that we all suffer from, right? So that's where the liberation struggle that I'm engaged in. And I believe el ejemplo de Cuba, the example of Cuba is an excellent example. The self-determination and the kind of system has to be addressed at the rudimentary level, where we know we have to look at changing the economy to be a more sustainable economy, and that's the work that's being done on the ground now by a lot of mutual aid groups, a lot of groups that are community run. So I always, and this is a conversation me and Nicole has always had, that every effort is an effort towards liberation, right? Regardless of what you do, you always the effort to liberation. But in order for us to drink coffee, we have to grow it. In order for us to have food, we have to grow it. And that's where the economy is not at right now. The economy right now, you have these high companies, these vulture biochemical companies that are doing cryptocurrency and all of that stuff. So we have to liberate ourselves from that. But again, in Cuba, the revolution and the revolution continues to live. It happens slowly, in spite of being under constant attack by the imperial power of the United States. So it's slow, but I like the direction it's going in with the new generation and the organizing that's being done on the grassroots. And I think that's one way of engaging in the liberation struggle.
There's a lot of ecological resistance happening all the time to sort of toxic and international companies that are both affecting just, in Long Beach, we have a plant that has a sister plant in Puerto Rico, so stuff like that.
That's right. That's right.
I think I have a couple more minutes. Ruby?
Doc Ruby has a hand up.
Dr. Ruby?
Yes, I think you kind of answered my question. I was going to ask you about the consciousness groups, and you were talking about self-determination and the colonization. And I was wondering about the organizations and everything that will give the people the will to come together and make the changes they need to without the fear. So I was wondering about that growing.
I think there's a lot of optimism, however that looks in terms of that the grassroots is winning in both from the educational struggles to environmental and sustainability and mutual aid. I think there's a strong grassroots at kind of the Maria generation of coming out of this. The young people in Puerto Rico have seen nothing but sort of disaster after disaster and crises. And so they have a strong sense of, like outside of US politics, like how to live and fight and create community. So that's very promising.
And if I could just say something, Michael, I'd like to apologize to Carol Francis, because I always call her Carol Francis. Please accept my apology. I'll working on it, but I'm getting old and I start to forget things.
Yes, I did want to say a couple of things. I think it's important for people to understand that in Puerto Rico itself, they have tried to overcome the division on the status question. In other words, the victories that Lawrence talked about around Vieques, around the release of the Puerto Rican political prisoners, around the environmental struggle, and the recent effort. They drove the governor from office a couple of years ago because of his corruption and disdain for his own people. All those things were when they set aside the question and the divisions about status to deal with certain issues, because the division about status is a reflection of the divide and conquer efforts of the United States to separate and divide the Puerto Rican people from among themselves. So there has been a conscious effort to overcome the division on status that's historically been the electoral issue and so on and so forth, to say that we're going to set that aside and deal with the environment, deal with the corruption, deal with the impact of PROMESA and so on and so forth. So, and PROMESA, by the way, is this fiscal control board that was put in place by the U.S. Congress and Obama to control the economy and the governmental spending in Puerto Rico. Very colonial. The other thing I wanted to say is that from our perspective as people in the United States, we should identify the question of statehood as annexation, because that's what it is. I'm saying as the colonizing power, we have a responsibility to oppose the occupation and military control of Puerto Rico. And I think we have the a responsibility to oppose the annexation of Puerto Rico. If the Puerto Rican people, absent U.S. domination control, want to decide that statehood is their solution, that's a different question. But as it's posed as an act of the U.S. Congress, it's unacceptable. And I think that's a principled position.
I thank you all so much. I'm just gonna log off now. I sorry to be so abrupt about it, but I'm gonna jump out. I can send links to the articles. Some of them I pulled from my presentation, if that's of interest afterwards, and other resources. Thank you. It was so nice to be with you all this morning.
Gracias, hermana.
Bye. Yeah.
Gracias, hermana.
Thank you.
Cuídate.
Michael.
Tengan un buen día.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I did get the right link finally in the chat for Puerto Ricans in Action. There it's.
Well,
She froze.
Steve, you have a hand up?
Yes, with Lauren still with us, and I appreciate that so much. So we've gotten a much more refined, subtle understanding, at least of where you're coming from, and I think, Nicole, in terms of independence, I think you spoke to this, that it's really a question of the Puerto Rican people to decide their future. If that's the framework, can you give this group, we have our activist side, we are representatives of a variety of other faith groups and other groups. Do you have any recommendations of how we can advance the approach that you're recommending?
Thank you, Steve. I held you in high esteem. Appreciate the question. So, and I would just endorse. I completely jump in the pocket of Michael Novick when he mentioned how we have to engage in the liberation struggle, and we have to really put a picture as to what Puerto Rico is. Puerto Rico is completely annexated to the United States. Like I was saying, we can't go to the bathroom without asking the Congress for permission. So I think knowing that it's a process, and that the struggles that are being engaged in by our new generation on the ground in regards to engaging in every act of liberation that they can, grassroots and stuff like that. But it is a decision that has to be made solely by the Puerto Rican people. And that includes Puerto Rican people as myself in the diaspora, in the belly of the beast, and Puerto Rican people on the island. They have to be given that opportunity to engage in a vote that's not influenced or is not tempered by an act of Congress, if you will, because we have been there's been many acts of Congress. At one time, we couldn't even show the flag because there was a gag law and La Ley de Madrasa that meant we could not have physically in opposition. So a lot of people think that Puerto Ricans have a flag fetish. No, it's not. It's a form of resistance to show that flag proudly. That's why you'll see it in the cars, you see it everywhere, because it's a victory of the resistance. It's a victory of liberation that we were able to finally hold on to our flag and to fly proudly, where at other times we were oppressed or we were arrested, we were thrown in jail for even having that flag. So it's incremental, Steve. I guess that's the best way I could do it. But it has to be a decision that's tempered and completely immersed in the principle of self-determination. And we have to call Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and all of those so-called designated territories, as the United States calls them, There are colonies that have been annexated. And the Philippines is still struggling against the history of the criminal U.S. policies that were imposed on them. And the Hawaiian people as well, they are still struggling for self-determination. There's an actual movement in Hawaii for people engaging in the struggle for self-determination still. So, and you know, my mother always used to say this, my mom used to say, Puerto Rico sería libre un día, Puerto Rico will be free one day. I may not see it with you, but it will be free one day. And that's what I tell my son. I say, you know, and I tell my friends, Puerto Rico will be free one day. I don't know if I'll be there, but I will continue to engage and engage in the lifelong struggle for a liberated Puerto Rico.
I want to add a couple of things, if I may. You know, I think I heard earlier in the discussion that it was stated that about 60% of the current population of Puerto Rico are native Puerto Ricans. And that's a tremendously troubling figure, and it reflects a conscious policy of the United States of depopulation and repopulation. It's being encouraged as a retirement community for the military that have been posted to Puerto Rico. They stay there. I mean, there is some migration from other Caribbean countries and Dominicans and so on, but the predominance is that it's people from the U.S. being transplanted into Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico being dispersed to the United States. And for example, after the hurricane, the main money that FEMA put out was actually to ship Puerto Ricans out of Puerto Rico and to the United States. So I think that that's a very, very serious concern when people have raised this question of Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans. And I think in terms of our responsibility here, again, it is to demand demilitarization, decolonization. All the different status groups in Puerto Rico now, the independentistas, the pro-statehood people, and even the Commonwealth people now cast whatever they're advocating as a form of decolonization, as everybody recognizes that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. The problem is that they're switching from a classic colonial system to the kind of settler colonialism and displacement that has taken place in the U.S. itself on native land. And they are constantly trying to remove Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico and replace them with a colonizing population. I think it's a very, very, that's a question of genocide in my mind. Cal Francis has the hand up.
Yes. Could you, Fernando, Lawrence, you talked about the murder, the assassination of independence leaders. And I'd like to know more about what's going on on the ground in Puerto Rico. Like, how could you just elaborate on the repression of the independence movement?
Oh yeah,
and how much do people know about it?
You know, and that's an excellent question, Carol Francis, and it's highlighted throughout some of the narrative that Michael shared with you. But I would just go to Don Pedro Visu Campos, who was subject to radiation as a political person. Constant radiation to the point where they had to let him go, and he died immediately after that. Juan Mari Bras's son, the father of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, his son was murdered in Seco Maravilla. So there's a lot of genocide that's going on, political genocide that's going on in regards to the Puerto Rican independence struggle. And, you know, and I just remind you, you know, the stance that
You lost
the
your
fact
Lawrence?
that
No,
there's some, okay, you hear me now? No? Do you hear me?
yeah.
Do you hear me? Yeah, okay. So, so I think what I'm encouraged about, Carol Francis, is the new generation, right? And the development of revolutionary autonomous communities throughout the island. When I was in the island, I give you one example. When I was in the island recently with my son, there was a place where they grew one of the world's best coffee at the time, Café Giordano. And when we went to a store in the Pueblo, we couldn't get that coffee. But down the block, there was a Burger King, right? And everybody from the town was at that Burger King. And you know why they were at that Burger King early in the morning? Because they had the Puerto Rican coffee. Puerto Ricans cannot export or import their own products that they grow. So what we're saying as part of the self-determination and the complete liberation of our people is being able to develop that alternate economy that Cuba did after the special period, if you will. So those things need to happen. Puerto Rico, we need to start going to the root, and we need to start growing our food, and we need to start developing an economy that's free of metals, that's free of biochemicals, and that's free of strip mining of natural resources for medicines. That's what we have to do, because we have a rich, very rich land. Our food demonstrates that. Thank you. And I think David has a question, Michael.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Or comment.
I just was curious to know what Lawrence's what Lawrence can tell us, or anyone else who has information, but particularly Lawrence, what you can tell us about the mayor of San Juan, because she seems to be a voice that contradicts a lot of the establishment of the Democratic Party, and she seems to have seems to speak with a voice that opposes the colonization, particularly the financial colonization. Can you tell us anything about her and what you see as her part in this struggle? Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think you're talking about Carmen Yulín. And Carmen Yulín, when she did declare various times, going against her own party, that Puerto Rico was a colony. I mean, she admitted it. And her party has a hard time admitting, Michael, her party has a hard time admitting that Puerto Rico is a colony. So, yeah, she has spoken truth to power, especially when Trump was in office. But she's recently has reverted back to Partido Popular Democrático, which is the party that holds up the status quo of a colony. So, but she is very articulate, and she did run for governor, but she did not prevail. And we thought at one time that she was going to change parties and become an independentista, but she didn't, and so she reverted back. But she speaks truth to power, and she's definitely I would say she's a Democrat with a little D, not a big D Democrat.
I think it's true that in the last election, right, there were a lot of new parties appeared in Puerto Rico that were outside the traditional status division that has existed between the Statehood Party, the Commonwealth Party, and the Independence Party. And it was a much more diverse vote outside of that context. The other thing I want to say is that historically, the independence movement in Puerto Rico has itself been divided because the predominant politics of the independence movement has actually been non-electoral. The Nationalist Party was not really an electoral party, and the Puerto Rican Socialist League was not. They believe that it's an electoral farce to carry out an election under the conditions of military occupation. So there is the PIP, which is the Independence Party, that has had electoral politics, but a lot of the independentistas are abstentionists. And as Lawrence said, the 60% abstention rate in that last so-called plebiscite reflected the fact that a lot of people do not see an electoral path to dealing with this in the context of still being controlled by the U.S. and having to respond to an act of Congress. The other thing I wanted to say, Just
Go ahead, Mark.
one last
Yeah.
point is that if Puerto Rico were admitted to the United States, it would be twice as poor as the poorest state in the United States, which is Mississippi. And that reflects the fact that it's a direct colony, and the economy of Puerto Rico has been completely distorted by U.S. domination and control for over 100 years.
Thank
Go
you.
ahead, Mark.
And Puerto Ricans, we already have experience living in statehood. We have experienced that with the constant poverty and the conditions, object conditions in the communities that we have been designated to or segregated to, if you will. And then just quickly, yeah, Michael's correct. There have been the resurfacing of Partido Ciudadano, for instance, won, I think, 20% of the seats. Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño, which is a pro-independence party, got the most votes that they've gotten since 1951, when Puerto Rico was going through the Commonwealth process, when they were being designated as a colony, with Don Pedro Luis Ocampo was offered to be the governor, and he said he would not sell out his people. La patria no se vende. But Luis Muñoz Marín did. So there is progress, but again, it's incremental progress. But I'm very alarmed with the depopulation that's going on right now, where the decimation of the Puerto Rican natural resources, which is rich. You go to the rainforest, you go to waterfalls in Puerto Rico, and there's medicines all over the place. And those medicines are being strip mined by biochemical companies. So that concerns me. So one of the things that I would encourage you to do is go to PuertoRicansInAction.org, because they have a website and they have a wealth of resources, PuertoRicansInAction.org. And also Boricua Human Rights Network, if you want to, Boricua Human Rights Network, I believe it's .org, right, or .net, one of those two. So Boricua Human Rights Network.org and PuertoRicansInAction.org has a wealth of information in regards to the liberation struggle.
And that should conclude this program, because we still have a business to attend to.
Okay, thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, Lawrence and Nicole. I always said that as long the imperialism is there in our country and your country, we would not be free. And so let's just put it that way.